Okay, I feel like we better get started. On to the later emperors. So we're on the bottom of page 58. And our goal is to get to the end of 65 today. Oh, this is going to be exciting. We'll see how it works. So we talked a little bit about Julius Caesar and Octavian Augustus. After Octavian comes a guy named Tiberius. So Tiberius would have been the emperor that appointed Pontius Pilate. He would be the emperor when Jesus died. Tiberius. After Tiberius comes a guy named Caligula. You might have heard of him before. No one really liked him. He was mean and he wasn't really friends with anyone. He got mad at the Senate, so he appointed his horse to be consul, which meant his horse was a general of the army. And he liked to mock people, and so they killed him. That's kind of the way it goes sometimes. And then there was a guy named Claudius. Some of these, if you want to dive into more Roman history, I would encourage you to do so. Roman history is really exciting, but we're not going to be able to spend as much time as I'd like with all of these people. Some of them end up being in civil administration, end up doing significant things and making significant achievements, but Roman stuff vis-a-vis Christianity, they're not all equally important for. The next guy that becomes problematic, though, is Nero. Nero, again, is someone who has a little bit of a bad rap in the modern world, and probably rightfully so. He was kind of psycho. But he does a few things, civil-wise, again, that are important for the city of Rome. We'll talk much more about him when we get to Roman persecutions, because Nero is someone who starts what's called the first Roman persecution. We don't know exactly if that's true. At first the Roman authorities seem to be relatively ambivalent about Christianity. They don't seem to have had a lot of contact. It's sort of who are they? What do they do? They're not very concerned. Christianity is just another group in a giant empire, and they got problems. Lots of them are fighting the Germans on the north side of the Alps. That was an area of significant tension. Vespasian. So right at the time of Nero, if you remember, this is where I should have probably put more timelines. So Nero is emperor when the Jewish uprising is really starting to gain steam against the Romans. And Vespasian is the general that's over there, who is controlling the army. Vespasian is another one of these kind of genius emperors. Militarily, he was quite excellent. And so as soon as I think Nero is murdered by his guards. I forget. You have to look up some of these stories. It's just crazy. There's a reason why the emperors start to pay their guards really well, and it's because they killed lots of ones who didn't. It was pay up or don't sleep too soundly. So Vespasian leaves just as they're getting ready. I forget if they had started the siege of Jerusalem or not, but it's right around his time, and so his son Titus takes over. Titus is the one that leads the siege of Jerusalem and the ultimate destruction of the remaining Jewish forces at Masada in the desert. So Nero and Vespasian and Titus, they are the emperors at the time of the collapse of Jewish society, in the sense of Jewish temple life, Jewish sacrificial system, and the significant destruction of Israel and the removal of the people from Israel. Domitian is another one. I think he is known to have had at least some Christians killed. Some Christian martyrs are in the time of Domitian, but he it wasn't one of the major ones. This is the time that is called the Pax Romana. And what happens is a little bit like the United States, that in this time period, the wars and the fights moved to the borders of the Roman Empire instead of the internal part. What would that allow when you take war out of the country? It would allow growth and a kind of blossoming. Instead of destroying things, your energy is put into building them. And so internally, the Roman Empire at this time becomes significantly more wealthy because you can sail across the Mediterranean. They're building roads. The roads are protected by the Roman army. Now, if you live in the hinterlands, like if you live north of the Alps, you don't have very much peace. You would not call this the Pax Romana and talk about the beauty of it, because the Romans and the Germanic tribes fought fairly constantly. The Romans win some battles, but they're never able to really push. They're never able to invade and conquer as much of the Germanic lands as they would like. So they kind of form a stalemate. I think it's by the river, the Danube. But there's a river north of the Alps, and the Romans sort of come to this uneasy peace where it's like, we'll occupy this side, you occupy that side, and as long as you don't come over here, we won't come over there. You know, if you live on the frontiers, if you remember, Gaul, on the other hand, France, was conquered by Julius Caesar. So there, Julius Caesar was enough of a military general and an intelligent enough man that he managed to outfox and outsmart the Germanic tribes. And so the Romans control all of the modern day French area. And I think even into the lowlands, the countries of the lowlands, so Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, those kind of things. The Roman military is an important part of the history of the Roman Empire. We aren't as used to this because we haven't faced it, but even in a lot of countries in the modern world, the military kind of rules the show. A great one is Pakistan. Pakistan and Egypt are two essentially military dictatorships. The military isn't formally in charge of everything, but if they don't like you, you're in charge of nothing. Because they have the control, they have the power, they have the authority, and they have the guns. So they have sometimes presidents or people that are sort of puppets that are the public face, but the real power is held in the hands of the military. That's very much Pakistan. Egypt was very much that way. The history of Egypt is rather sad if you look at it. But the Roman army is a bit like this. To be emperor, you need to control the army because the army is enormous. And if the army doesn't like you, then you're not emperor. Or at least if enough of the army doesn't like you, then you're not emperor. And this happens several times, where someone declares himself to be emperor, and the army legions are like, no, we want this guy. And then they march on Rome and they kill the other guy and they put their guy in. And the Romans figure this out quite quickly. And so part of what they do, part of the Roman genius is that I think a Roman military career was about 20 years. If you served 20 years in the army, what they would start doing is you could become sort of a nobleman in the provinces. So they would pick provinces around the Mediterranean, especially that needed to be pacified, that needed good local leadership, and they'd send former army officers there. But even if you were a slave and you served for 20 years, you would be freed. Serving in the army had some significant benefits. Wasn't necessarily good for your health that you survived 20 years, but if you did, it was fairly lucrative. And you had a paycheck, which is very much not guaranteed in the ancient world, and they would feed you. Not always good food, but it was in their interest to keep you alive. And that's not the case for lots of people that live just in the countryside. If you don't have a nobleman or a wealthy person who has a vested interest in keeping you alive, in lots of cases, you died. The Roman army was also a path to citizenship. If you served in the army, you got to become a citizen, which was a big deal. Then you could, they didn't have democracy quite like we do today, but citizenship was important. Citizenship was this thing that was filled with respect. It opened a lot of doors to public jobs, to authority and wealth in society. So that was a big deal. The Romans also saw this process of sending the army out and civilizing these things as part of this growth of civilization. It was part of the civitas that we were talking about last time. This idea of the city, the people, the group, and being part of something larger. The economic prosperity, now this is one of the parts where you start to see the crossover. That economic prosperity, once the wars move to the outside and you're living in the midst of the Roman peace, trade increases, right? There's lots more people that are trading a lot more things. And so if you're Christian missionaries and you're trying to get places, guess what? This is in your best interest. Because it's I want to get to Egypt. Well, I'm sailing to Egypt. Great. Come on board. Sometimes they probably paid their way, but that increase in trade allows them to travel much more easily and allows something else to happen. Can anyone guess at the other one? Evangelization, but I was thinking of something a little bit more particular, something that we start having a lot of. They start sending letters back and forth. They're writing things. That's where the scriptures come from. St. Paul will write his letters and he'll ship them off to Corinth or to Rome or to all these places, and they can get there more easily because of these trade ships, because of these things that are moving back and forth. Because the Romans had a postal system, but calling it a postal system should make the U.S. Postal Service come in and kill us with axes. Because the idea that you could write something in Rome and send it to Egypt wasn't the bread and butter of society. Usually you had to pay for a messenger to take it, and you had to pay their expenses for their journey. There's a little bit of a postal system, but it's not like we have today. So the more people you have moving around and the more trade you have, the more easy it is to get these things from one place to another. And this also ends up encouraging one of the sort of funny things that the Roman army becomes very good at. What do they build? Roads. So one of the major activities of the Roman army in peacetime is that they were road builders. And Roman roads were really good. They figured out a lot of this stuff. They had a method for building them and how they would do it. Roman roads, you should look up Roman roads and how you build them, because modern traffic engineers still study what the Romans figured out. They had a sense of where you use aggregates and where you use gravel and where you use sand and why you do this and why you do that. There are some Roman roads that they built at this time that are still in existence. You can still drive on them. Think about what that means. 2,000 years later, you can still use some Roman roads. There are very few of our asphalt roads that seem to have survived 40 years or 50 years. Now, it's not all North Dakota climate, but there's places where there's still Roman roads, and you can see them. They were good at this. And that was a way to keep the army from killing people you didn't want them to, is you make them build roads everywhere. But it also means that if you have to think of it a little bit like globalization even now, the cities that are most connected to the global economy, it's major cities that are most a part of this. It's major cities even in the Roman Empire that are most connected to Rome. That's where they build most of their architecture, their temples. That's where they do these kind of things that are very, very Roman feeling. So if you lived in Alexandria, for instance, it was a very Roman feeling city. If you live in the boondocks outside, it was probably mud bricks and huts. You know, like, you kind of have to see it a lot more as a hub and spokes. So the major cities were very civilized, very Roman. They were protected by a wall. They would always build a wall around the city. They would have the most connection to the empire. That's where the governor of the province lived, was in usually the largest city in the region. And so there's kind of a distinction between the cities that become most connected to Roman society and Roman stuff, and the smaller villages and towns in the countryside. Remember that communication still takes a long time. Not quite as long as you'd think. There was a lecture that I was listening to that talked about the rule of sevens, and it's a helpful way to conceive of things. So the rule of sevens is that a horse covers in 1 day what someone on foot covers in 7 days. And a ship covers in 1 day what a horse does in 7 days. So if it would take you a week to sail somewhere, it would very often take, like 200 days to walk there, or something like 50 days to ride horse. And so that helps us get more of a sense of how time works and how much faster ships are than we give them credit for. I mean, just the fact that you can sail at night and keep moving is a big deal. Now, you don't always move in the good directions, but you just have to remember that communication takes longer. And this becomes really important, like in the persecutions, right? Because if the emperor decides in Rome, okay, we're going to start killing the Christians, what has to happen? The message has to get there, but even before it has to get there, first it has to be written and copied. And that has to be done by hand. So even if you're an emperor and you have a set of scribes, they would have like a lecturer who would read off a text that scribes would copy. Some of it they would write on wax tablets, and then they would seal them into these boxes, and then they'd stamp it on the outside so you could tell if it was opened. But somehow you have to write it, and that process isn't short if you're writing it by hand. And then you have to get them to the right people and send them off as messengers. And where are those messengers going to go first? To the cities, like we just talked about. Like the major, that's where if you start to feel the hub and the spokes. So the major messages are first going to be written to the cities, and that's where the messenger will go first. There's most commerce there, so it's most likely that they would sail there, or they'd travel by ship there, and it would take, another maybe month or even 2 months to get it from the city out into the towns of the countryside. And if you live in a little village like Sells, North Dakota, and it's barely on the map, it might take a year to get to you. And then it gets to you and you're like, well, what do we do with this? They all left. Throw it on the pile with all the other stuff that they sent us. You have to kind of start to feel how these problems feed into each other. And so especially when we start talking about Roman persecutions, how do you launch something empire-wide? The answer is it takes forever. It's just big and unwieldy, and that's part of the problem in the ancient world, is that stuff just takes forever. So if, for instance, this is one of the backwards parts that is even, I think, in the American Revolution, is there's several battles that are fought after the peace has been formally signed. We've already agreed to a ceasefire. And then it's like the British and the Americans fight a giant battle. Isn't one of them in New Orleans or something? And it's like 2 weeks after the war was over. Well, the news hadn't come back yet that the war was over. So they were still fighting. And so it's like the Romans, if they start a persecution in, say, 200, it might take to 201 or 202 before the people in the countryside hear about it. And by then, it's stopped in Rome, and there's a new emperor because the army killed someone or something like that. And so now they have to write a new set of messages and send them out, and that takes a year or two to get out there. And if you're in the provinces, and it's like, it's easy to imagine them sitting around their table, we'll use an American image, drinking coffee, and some letter shows up from Rome, and they're like, well, what does that idiot think again? Oh, you need to do this. You need to pay me more taxes. He always says that. Go away. Right? Like, there's a lot less accountability. There's a lot less instantaneous communication. And that works in both directions. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. In a lot of cases, for modern ears, it's just sort of funny. Because it's like, if you ignore the Roman order, it'll probably take 6 months to get back to them that you didn't listen to it. And then, then they have to decide what to do, and then they have to send another messenger out. So, you take it with a grain of salt. Like, do I really want to do this or not? And you're going to have people that are really committed, like, no, Rome said we must do it. And you're going to have a lot of other people that are more pragmatic or more political, we would call them, and be like, well, what should we do? This will upset the populace. We should ask some people. So they gather a council of their fellows, usually rich people, and they ask them, what should we do? And they're like, let's throw this messenger in the river. Okay, chalk. And eventually the Senate would be like, well, where'd our messenger go? We don't have their tax revenue. And then someone would go looking for him, and they'd come to the place where the messenger went, and they'd say, oh, he got lost. Didn't come. I mean, it is just like, this is the way that the world worked. And the fact that it doesn't work this way now, or at least most of the time it doesn't work this way, is relatively unique in history. It's not like, oh, it's always been this way and people have always been good. It's like, no, people have always been bad. And we finally live in an era where there's enough accountability to catch the bad ones and weed some of them out. So the Christians, as the people start moving around, as there's this trade, they go to Alexandria. That's one of the earliest missions, 1st century. Saint Mark the Evangelist is credited as the founder of the church. Now, he probably went there. Was he the first Christian there? I think it's unlikely because it's a giant city. And if you remember, there's a giant Jewish community there, and Jewish synagogues were almost always where the Christians preached first. But St. Mark is credited as the founder, that sometime after he wrote his gospel in the 60s, he leaves Rome and he goes to Alexandria. Damascus is the first major city north of Israel. If you remember, Paul was on his way to Damascus when he has his encounter with Jesus, and there was an important Jewish community there. The modern city of Damascus, to somewhat of our surprise, is actually in the same spot. The ancient city, I think, was closer to the mountains or something outside of town. But Damascus. In Damascus, the Syrians speak a language called Aramaic. This was the language of Jesus. This is the language that they used in Galilee. This is the language that many of the apostles would have spoken. That's just kind of a neat part. Edessa is a city you've probably never heard of, but it ends up being an important place. It's on the Turkish plateau, the Turkish highlands, and it's further north of Damascus. There was an important Jewish community there, and in the early church, that becomes an important center of missionary activity. Because what we're going to see eventually is that the ancient world will fracture along linguistic lines. So the Aramaic, Syriac speaking, it becomes known as Syriac. Those Christians go off in one direction. Eventually the Greek speaking Christians become mostly Orthodox, and the Latin speaking Christians become mostly Catholic. And so these linguistic boundaries become very important. One of the surprising things about Edessa, though, is that this is one of the first countries to embrace the faith as a whole, or at least in their leadership. So by rumor or legend, the ruler sends a letter to Jesus asking him to come and heal him because he's sick. Their story is that Jesus sends a letter back and says, I can't. My mission is to the Jewish people, but I will send one of my followers who will come and heal you. So, I wonder if I said this wrong. My note might be wrong. I might have meant to say, Jesus sent Thaddeus there. I don't know why I would have said Thomas. Silly apostles, you get confused with all their names and which name is in which language, right? Because Thaddeus shows up in some of the lists, but I don't think he's in other ones, and I'm not really sure if Thaddeus is the same as Thomas or not. But eventually one of the apostles goes there. Good enough. Remember, so these are to the north a little bit and to the east. Remember that to go directly east of Israel doesn't really work because it's a giant desert. And they don't really go across it in the ancient world like we do now. Another place they travel very quickly is Cyprus. Cyprus was an island in the Mediterranean. And again, because the Romans weren't good sailors, they're not very fond of the sea, having a giant island that you can stop at to be safe from the storms is really, really helpful. That means that Cyprus was a center of commerce. And Paul, if you recall, those of you who are with me for the book of Acts, Paul and Barnabas go to Cyprus very early on one of their journeys. The seafaring communities, if you look at a map of how Christianity starts spreading, it's to the major ports first, because they travel on ships, because it's so much faster than going over land. So the communities in Greece, the Greeks were very, very fond of shipbuilding. Modern day Turkey, remember at this time it wasn't Turkish, it was Greek. Turkey historically was part of the Greek world. It's only after the rise of the Muslims and later the Ottomans that Turkey changes. And they actually commit a genocide and kill a whole bunch of the Greek speakers and try and destroy their culture. One of the parts of the modern world that they don't like to tell you about our good old NATO ally Turkey. Other places along the Mediterranean Sea. It seems like a few ports in Spain and France on the very southern coast that are part of the Mediterranean. And then, some places in Italy, like places near the sea. That's where Christianity goes first, because they travel more quickly by boat. And usually you have places near the sea that already have a Jewish community. That connection to Jewish synagogue seems to be important. Many of the early converts, the earliest converts, were from Judaism. But one of the challenges that we run into is that the Christians were already developing what's called the Disciplina Arcani, which means the discipline of the secret. Because Christianity was a somewhat persecuted religion, even if it's not persecuted widely, they start to keep their internal stuff only for believers. So their evangelization was different. They didn't talk about the Eucharist as openly. They don't talk about the way that they celebrate the Mass. They don't have as much public-facing stuff as we're used to, because at this time they practice what was called the discipline of the secret. So much of it was only shared within the Christian community for people that were already part of it, because they didn't want the authorities to find out. And they didn't want the pagans to misconstrue their ideas. And so there's funny things in history. Like the early Romans, when they start the persecution of the Christians, persecute them for being cannibals, because they would catch whispers of the Christians eating the flesh of their gods. Well, you start to see how some of the teaching could be construed that way if you didn't know, if it's just part of the rumor mill. Like those are things that happen. They talk about a weird baptism ritual, and so people make these fantastical stories about what the Christians are doing in baptism and those kind of things. And the Christians basically don't say boo for a while because they practice what's called the discipline of the secret. It's not until the middle of the 2nd century that we have the first writings that actually start systematically explaining the life of the Christians, in people like Irenaeus of Lyon and Justin Martyr, who we'll cover a bit later. But we do have a few documents. So the first one that comes out is called the Didache. It is an early document. This was lost for like 1600 years. No one knew what it was. We knew that other Christians talked about it, but someone finally found it in an old text in a library in like the 1800s. And they're like, oh, this is that thing that they were mentioning. And then they start printing copies of it. So this work begins with something on the way of life and the way of death. It picks up a scriptural image. If you look at Psalm 1, it talks about that, the way of wisdom and the way of folly. It's in Proverbs, that same kind of theme. Follow the Lord Jesus Christ or follow a path of death. It talks about the moral life, to love God, to avoid sin. This is the first mention of the Christian prohibition of abortion. So the pro-life movement will talk about this, that the Christians, the earliest document that we have outside of the New Testament is probably this one, and they already go after. The Romans had this practice that they called exposure. So if you didn't want a child, the Greeks practiced this too. The woman would bear the child and then they'd leave it out to die in the countryside. That was considered part of this abortion culture. And they did find various herbal things, various plant things that would contribute to a miscarriage or to abandoning a pregnancy. And the Christians started arguing against that right away.
Did you say that was the 2nd century?
The Didache is 1st century.
But I meant abortion. Is that still 1st century?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it actually shows up. They use the word in this Didache document. And it also argues pretty strongly against enchanting and idolatry and New Agey sounding stuff that was common in the pagan world. It has a list of sins. You can look at those. We need to move a little bit more quickly. Tells the Christians to pray the Our Father 3 times a day. That was part of the ancient Jewish pattern. And this is why in the church, you actually have an Our Father that you pray at Mass, and in morning prayer, and in evening prayer, if you do those two. And so even today, the church discipline preserves saying the Our Father 3 times a day. If you don't do morning and evening prayer, and you want to behave like the ancient Christians, you should say the Our Father at least 3 times a day. It's a good discipline to have. It talks about baptism in the Eucharist. It's more explicit than the New Testament. It harps on, don't give credence to those who come and preach for money. I wish some modern American Christians would have heard of that.